What happens when the person you trusted the most betrays you in the most shocking way? A wife's desperate fight for survival against her husband's deadly secrets. This true crime thriller will leave you breathless. Will she make it out alive or fall victim to the one she once loved? Keep watching to find out. The clock ticked faintly in the background. A dim light flickered above the dining table, casting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Emma sat, her hands trembling against the cool surface of a coffee cup. The house was silent, yet her mind was screaming. Outside, the rain tapped against the window pane, a soft rhythm that only heightened her unease. She had found the envelope on the kitchen counter an hour ago. No address, no name, just her husband's initials scrawled hastily on the flap. Her fingers fumbled as she opened it. The papers inside made her stomach lurch. A legal document. A will. It wasn't the existence of the will that struck her, it was the date. Signed just days before their 10th wedding anniversary. Her husband, Mark, had never mentioned this. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as she skimmed the details. His assets. Their shared home. All transferred to a woman she had never heard of. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. Who was this woman? Why hadn't Mark told her? The front door creaked open and Emma froze. Mark stepped in, his coat dripping from the rain. He looked startled to see her standing there, the will clutched in her hand. "Where did you find that?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Emma's throat was dry. She tried to speak but couldn't. Mark moved closer, his face pale, his jaw tense. "Emma, listen to me. Who is she?" Emma's voice cracked. The words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Mark hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door, then back to her. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice shaky. But Emma knew. The faint smell of perfume on his coat wasn't hers. The way he flinched under her gaze spoke volumes. And then the sound. A thud from the basement. Both of them turned toward the darkened hallway. Emma's heart pounded as the noise came again, louder this time. Mark's expression changed.
Fear. Panic.
"Stay here," he said, his voice firm. But Emma didn't trust him anymore. Not after what she had just discovered. The sound grew louder, more frantic. Something or someone was down there. Emma's hand gripped the edge of the table as Mark moved toward the basement door. His movements were slow, calculated, as if he were stalling for time. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound sharper, every shadow darker. Emma's eyes darted to the knife block on the counter. Her instincts screamed at her to grab one, but her body refused to move. Mark reached the basement door and paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He turned to her, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't follow me," he said, his voice low and urgent. The words sent a shiver down her spine. He opened the door, and a cold draft wafted into the kitchen, carrying the faint smell of damp concrete. The thuds were louder now, echoing up the stairs like a heartbeat. Mark descended slowly, the old wooden steps creaking beneath his weight. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing with questions and scenarios. She strained her ears, catching fragments of muffled sounds. Voices?
It was impossible to tell.
Then, a loud crash from below made her jump. Her pulse raced as she edged toward the basement door, her bare feet silent on the tiled floor. The faint glow from the basement light spilled onto the stairs, illuminating the worn wooden steps. Her hands shook as she gripped the railing and began to descend. Each step felt like a lifetime. The basement was colder than she expected, the chill wrapping around her like a vice. As she reached the bottom, she saw Mark standing in the center of the room. His back was to her, his posture rigid. In front of him was an old wooden chair. A woman sat bound to it, her head slumped forward, dark hair obscuring her face. Emma gasped, and Mark spun around, his eyes wild. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, stepping toward her. Emma backed away, her gaze flicking between Mark and the woman. "Who is she?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. The woman stirred, lifting her head slowly. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the woman's face came into view. She looked eerily familiar, like a distorted reflection of Emma herself. Mark's voice broke through her shock. "She knows too much," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "She wasn't supposed to find out." Emma's knees felt weak as she stared at the woman, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't yet form. The woman's lips parted, her voice hoarse but clear. "Help me," she whispered. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. The woman's plea echoed in the cold, empty basement. Mark moved closer to Emma, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "I can explain," he said, his voice tight, desperate. "Explain?" Emma's voice trembled. "You've tied someone up in our basement, Mark." The woman coughed, her body trembling against the ropes binding her to the chair. "Please," she croaked, her eyes locking onto Emma's. "Don't let him." "Quiet," Mark barked, turning sharply toward the woman. His outburst sent a fresh wave of fear through Emma. This wasn't the man she had married. She stumbled backward, bumping into a shelf. A box of tools rattled above her. Mark's gaze shifted back to her, his expression hardening. "This is bigger than you think, Emma. You need to trust me." "Trust you?" Emma's voice cracked as she clenched her fists. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could help her. The faint smell of gasoline lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of the damp basement. She spotted a wrench on the floor, partially hidden under the shelf. Mark took a step toward her. "Don't make this worse," he said, his voice eerily calm. The woman began to struggle against the ropes, her movements frantic. "Emma," she choked out, "he's lying to you. He'll hurt you too." Emma's legs felt like they would give out, but she forced herself to move. In a sudden motion, she bent down, grabbed the wrench, and held it in front of her like a weapon. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steadier than she felt. Mark stopped, his hands raised. "You don't understand," he said. "She's dangerous. She's not who you think she is." Emma's grip tightened on the wrench. "Then who is she?" she demanded, her voice rising. "And why is she in our basement?" Mark hesitated, his jaw clenching. She's my sister," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma blinked, stunned by the revelation. "Your sister?" she repeated, disbelief and confusion flooding her mind. The woman laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "Is that what he told you?" she rasped. "Ask him what he did to me. Ask him why I'm here." Emma's eyes flicked back to Mark, searching his face for the truth. But his expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and distant. The weight of the wrench in her hand felt heavier as a horrifying thought crept into her mind. What if she was the next one who wouldn't leave this basement alive? Emma's breaths came in shallow gasps, the wrench trembling in her hand. The basement felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. Mark's eyes darted between her and the woman in the chair, his face a mask of strained control. "She's manipulating you," he said, his voice firm but with a desperate edge. "She's dangerous, Emma. You don't know what she's capable of." The woman let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Me," she said, her voice cracking. "You're the one who locked me here. You're the one with blood on your hands." Emma's stomach churned at the words. "Blood?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark flinched, just for a moment, but it was enough. Emma's eyes darted to the floor, where faint stains marred the concrete, a dark, rusty hue spreading in uneven patches. Her throat tightened as the air seemed to grow colder. "What did you do, Mark?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What aren't you telling me?" Mark's shoulders slumped slightly, a flicker of guilt flashing across his face. "I had no choice," he said, his tone lower now, almost pleading. She was going to ruin everything. Our life. Our future. Emma took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribcage. Our future, she repeated, disbelief thick in her voice. What does that even mean? The woman in the chair struggled again, her voice hoarse but insistent. He's lying, she spat. He'll tell you anything to keep you from the truth. Mark turned on her, his face twisting in anger. Shut up, he snapped, his voice echoing off the walls. The sudden fury in his tone made Emma flinch. For the first time, she realized how dangerous he truly was. She tightened her grip on the wrench, the cold metal biting into her palm. Tell me the truth, Mark, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Who is she really? And why is she here? Mark's lips parted as if to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The woman broke it with a whisper that sent a chill down Emma's spine. He killed someone, Emma, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And I'm the only one who knows. Emma's knees threatened to buckle as the weight of the accusation settled over her. She stared at Mark, searching his face for denial, for a protest, for anything that might refute the claim. But all she saw was the guilt in his eyes, as clear as the bloodstains on the floor. Emma's voice wavered as she spoke. Is it true? Mark didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, his hands reaching out. Emma, he said softly, put the wrench down. Let's talk about this. But Emma could see the darkness behind his calm facade, and she knew she had no choice but to act. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears, her vision narrowing as Mark inched closer. The weight of the wrench in her hand anchored her, though her grip trembled. Mark's voice softened, his tone coaxing, almost hypnotic. You're scared, Emma. I get it, he said, taking another step. But I would never hurt you. You know that, don't you? Her eyes flicked to the woman in the chair, whose silent, pleading gaze screamed louder than any words. Stay back, Emma warned, her voice cracking. Mark froze, his jaw tightening. Think about everything we've built together, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. Our home, our life. Don't throw it away because of her lies. The woman let out a strained laugh, her voice dripping with bitterness. Lies, she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. She doesn't even know the half of it. Does she, Mark? Mark's head snapped toward the woman, his face twisting in fury. Shut your mouth, he barked, his composure slipping. Emma took a step back, her heart racing as she pieced together the fractured clues. The unfamiliar perfume, the hidden will, the bloodstains on the floor. You're going to kill her, Emma said, the realization tumbling from her lips. And then what? Make me the next victims? Mark's expression darkened, his calm mask shattering. You don't understand, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. I did this for us. For you? For me? Emma's voice rose, incredulous. How does any of this make sense? Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides. She wasn't supposed to be part of the plan, he muttered, almost to himself. She showed up, started asking questions, threatening everything. The woman struggled against her bindings, her voice growing louder. Because you killed someone, Mark, she shouted. Emma's stomach churned, her grip on the wrench tightening. Who, Mark? She demanded, her voice sharp and trembling. Who did you kill? Mark's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he spoke, his words chilling in their simplicity. Someone who wouldn't let us be happy. Emma's breath caught, the finality in his tone hitting her like a physical blow. Behind him, the woman's frantic movements grew more desperate. You're next, she rasped, her voice barely audible. Mark turned toward the woman, his jaw set, his body tensing. The shift gave Emma just enough time. With a surge of adrenaline, she raised the wrench high and brought it down with all her strength. The sound of metal striking flesh was sickening, a dull thud that reverberated through the room. Mark crumpled to the ground, clutching his head, groaning in pain. Emma stumbled back, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The woman's voice broke through the fog. "Emma," she cried. "The knife on the table. Hurry." Emma's legs felt like jelly as she moved, her bare feet slipping slightly on the cold floor. She grabbed the knife from the small folding table nearby and turned back to the woman. Her hands shook as she sawed through the ropes binding her wrists and ankles. The woman gasped in relief, her limbs trembling as she stood. Mark stirred on the floor, his groans turning into a low, menacing growl. Emma and the woman exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "We have to get out," Emma said, her voice a hoarse whisper. But before they could move, Mark's hand shot out, grabbing Emma's ankle with a crushing grip. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. Emma let out a cry, her balance faltering as Mark's hand tightened around her ankle. The cold, unrelenting grip sent a jolt of panic up her spine. "Let go of me," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. The woman lunged forward, her movements fueled by desperation. Grabbing the knife from Emma's trembling hand, she slashed at Mark's arm.
He roared.
In pain, his grip loosening just enough for Emma to stumble free. Mark rolled onto his side, clutching his bleeding forearm, his breaths ragged and filled with fury. Emma scrambled to her feet, the chaos around her blurring into a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. The woman grabbed her by the wrist. "Upstairs," she urged, her voice urgent but firm.
"Now."
They bolted toward the stairs, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete walls. Behind them, Mark's guttural growl grew louder as he forced himself to his knees. "You think you can just leave?" he bellowed, his voice echoing with rage. Emma reached the top of the stairs first, her trembling hands fumbling with the basement door. It felt stuck, or maybe her panic made her too clumsy to turn the knob. "Hurry," the woman urged, glancing back to see Mark staggering toward them, blood trailing behind him. With a final burst of effort, Emma yanked the door open, and they stumbled into the kitchen. The light overhead flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Emma slammed the door shut and locked it, her heart hammering in her chest. Mark's heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs behind it, each one sending a fresh wave of dread through her. The woman grabbed a chair and shoved it under the doorknob, barricading it. "It won't hold for long," she said, her voice breathless. Emma looked around the kitchen, her mind racing. The phone. She needed to call for help. But when she reached for it, the line was dead. Mark's voice came from the other side of the door, muffled but chilling. "You can't escape me," he snarled. "You'll never be free of this." The door rattled violently as he began pounding on it, the force making the chair creak under the pressure. The woman grabbed Emma by the shoulders, forcing her to focus. "Do you have a car?" she asked urgently. Emma nodded, her breath hitching. "The keys, they're by the front door." "Then we go now," the woman said, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. They bolted through the dimly lit house, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Behind them, the sound of splintering would tore through the air as Mark broke through the basement door. Emma's hands shook as she grabbed the keys from the hook near the front door. Mark's shadow loomed at the end of the hallway, his bloodied form staggering toward them, like a nightmare brought to life. "Run," the woman shouted, shoving Emma toward the door. Emma fumbled with the lock, her panic making every movement slower than it should have been. Finally, the door swung open, and they burst into the rain-soaked night. The cold air stung Emma's face as she sprinted toward the car, her bare feet splashing through puddles. Behind them, Mark's guttural roar cut through the storm. "You won't get away." Emma slid into the driver's seat, her shaking hands struggling to fit the key into the ignition. The woman jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as Mark emerged from the house, his silhouette monstrous against the flickering porch light. "Go," the woman yelled. The engine roared to life, and Emma slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as the car lurched forward, leaving Mark behind in the pouring rain. But as they sped away, Emma's relief was short-lived. The woman's voice was quiet, but heavy with warning. "This isn't over," she said. "He'll come for you again. And next time, he won't stop." The rain hammered against the windshield as Emma gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her breathing was shallow, her mind racing. The woman beside her was silent, staring ahead with an expression that was unreadable. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers was the only sound, but it did little to soothe Emma's frayed nerves. Her eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. The house was fading into the darkness, but her fear refused to follow. Mark's words echoed in her mind. "You'll never be free of this." Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. The woman turned to her, her face pale and drawn. "My name's Kara," she said. Her voice was steady now, but there was an edge to it, a layer of pain and exhaustion. Emma glanced at her, her chest tightening. "And what is he to you?" "Really?" Kara's gaze shifted to the rain-streaked window, her jaw tightening. "He's not my brother," she said flatly. Emma felt her stomach drop. "Then why would he say that?" Kara let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Mark lies. It's what he does." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. "I was his accomplice once. Years ago." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Accomplice?" Kara nodded, her expression darkening. "I thought I loved him. I thought I knew him. But then I saw what he was capable of." Her voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "He's not just a liar, Emma. He's a killer." Emma's hands tightened on the wheel, her mind struggling to process the weight of Kara's words. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kara looked at her, her eyes hollow. "He killed people who got in his way, who threatened his perfect little image." Her gaze dropped to her lap. "And when I tried to leave, I became his next target." Emma's breath hitched, her pulse racing. "And now me," she whispered, the reality sinking in. Kara nodded slowly. "He'll come after you. He always does. He doesn't let anyone go." Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. She looked at the dark road ahead, the rain blurring her vision. Her life, as she knew it, was gone. Mark wouldn't stop. And somehow, she had to survive. "We need help," Emma said, her voice firmer now. Kara shook her head, her lips curling into a grim smile. "You think the police can handle him? They can't. He's too careful. Too smart." Emma's grip on the wheel faltered. "So what do we do?" she asked, desperation creeping into her tone. Kara turned to her, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "We don't wait for him to come back," she said. "We stop him first." Emma's stomach twisted at Kara's words. The car sped through the rain-slicked streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Emma stole a glance at Kara, whose face was set in grim determination. "Stop him," Emma repeated, her voice low, almost disbelieving. Kara nodded, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her thigh. "He won't stop until he's dead or we are," she said plainly. Emma gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles aching. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a battle for survival against the man she once loved.
"How?"
Emma asked, her voice trembling. Kara hesitated, her jaw tightening as she stared out the window. "We catch him off guard," she said. "He thinks he's the predator. But predators don't expect prey to fight back." The words sent a shiver through Emma. She focused on the road ahead, her thoughts spinning in chaos. "What about the police?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Kara shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You think they'll believe you? A hysterical wife claiming her husband's a killer? With no body, no proof." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. Mark had been so careful, so deliberate. Every piece of evidence erased. And now, here she was, a fugitive in her own life. "He'll come after us soon," Kara said, her voice breaking through Emma's spiraling thoughts. Her words hung heavy in the air. "He's not going to wait. And neither can we." Emma's heart raced, her mind flashing back to the look in Mark's eyes, the cold, calculating rage. The rain continued to pour, the rhythmic drumming on the car roof a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. "What do we need to do?" Emma asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Kara looked at her, her gaze piercing. "We need to lure him out," she said. "Make him think he's still in control. And then we end it." Emma's hands trembled on the wheel, the weight of Kara's plan sinking in. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to find some other way. But deep down, she knew Kara was right. Mark wouldn't stop. And if they didn't act, he would find them. The car swerved into a desolate parking lot, the headlights illuminating the cracked pavement. Kara pointed to a small, abandoned motel ahead. "This will do for now," she said, her voice steady. Emma pulled into a spot, turning off the engine as the silence pressed down around them. The rain had lessened, a faint drizzle misting the windshield. Kara turned to Emma, her expression resolute.
"We rest for now," she said.
"But tonight we plan. By tomorrow, he'll be hunting us." Emma swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Her life had shattered into something unrecognizable. And now, she was about to face the darkest chapter yet. But if Mark wanted to find her, he would discover that the woman he'd underestimated was no longer afraid to fight back. The motel room smelled of mildew and old wood, its single flickering light casting long shadows across the cracked walls. Emma shut the door behind her, sliding the rusty chain lock into place. Her hands still shook, the adrenaline refusing to fade. Kara paced the small space, her boots scuffing against the stained carpet. She was quiet, her expression hard, calculating. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking under her weight. Her thoughts churned as she stared at the floor, tracing the pattern of faded stains. "Do you think he's already looking for us?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kara stopped pacing and turned to her, arms crossed. "He's looking," she said firmly. "Mark's smart, but he's impulsive when he feels threatened. That's what we need to use against him." Emma looked up, her chest tightening. "What if he finds us first?" Kara tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Then we don't let him win." Emma ran a hand through her damp hair, her mind racing. She had spent years believing she knew Mark, his habits, his thoughts, his heart. But now, she realized she'd only known the man he wanted her to see. Kara walked over to the small table by the window and pulled out a pen and a crumpled notepad from her bag. "First, we need to think like him," she said, flipping to a blank page. Emma frowned, unsure what Kara meant. "He's a predator," Kara continued, her voice low but firm. "He'll try to corner us, isolate us. He'll exploit our fear. But predators are vulnerable when they're lured into a trap." Emma stared at her, the words sinking in slowly. "What kind of trap?" she asked hesitantly. Kara's eyes darkened, her lips curling into a grim smile. "We give him what he wants," she said. "Or at least make him think he's getting it." The room fell silent as the weight of her plans settled over them. Emma's pulse quickened. "You mean me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kara didn't answer right away, her pen scratching across the notepad. Finally, she looked up, her expression softening just slightly. "You're his obsession," she said plainly. "That gives you power, Emma. Use it." Emma's stomach churned at the thought, her hands clenching into fists. "You're asking me to bait him," she said, her voice breaking. Kara nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "It's the only way to stop him," she said. "If we don't, he'll keep coming until it's too late." Emma swallowed hard, her mind spinning. The fear inside her screamed to run, to hide, to stay as far away from Mark as possible. But the truth was undeniable. Mark wouldn't stop until he had her. And if she didn't act, she wouldn't survive. Emma looked at Kara, the fear in her eyes slowly hardening into resolve. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Kara placed the notepad on the table, the rough outline of their plans sketched across the page. "We make him come to us," Kara said. "And this time, we're the ones who set the rules." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of control. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the soft patter of rain against the window. But inside the room, the storm was just beginning to brew. The silence in the room grew heavy as Kara leaned forward, her eyes locked on Emma's. The weight of the plan hung between them like a tangible force. Emma felt her heart race in anticipation, every nerve alive with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Kara's voice broke the stillness. "We need to make it look like you're vulnerable, like you're alone. It'll draw him in." Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "I'll be alone," she whispered, almost to herself. "He'll think I'm easy to grab." Kara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "That's exactly what we want. He'll lower his guard. But the moment he steps in, we turn the tables." Emma's chest tightened, her palms slick with sweat. What if he doesn't take the bait? What if he's too careful this time? Kara stood up, moving to the window and peering out into the rainy night. "He will," she said confidently. "He's been following you, watching, waiting for the right moment. He won't pass up the chance to finish what he started." The words sent a chill down Emma's spine. Kara turned back to face her, her expression softened just enough for Emma to see the fear beneath the hardened exterior. "Just remember," Kara said, her voice low, "you're not alone in this. We do this together." Emma nodded, her hands still trembling. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice shaky but determined. Kara moved to the table, pulling a small pouch from her bag. Inside, she revealed a set of tools, each one carefully chosen, each one crucial. A phone, a burner, one that wouldn't trace back to them. A few other items, wire, a small camera, a knife, enough to defend themselves if things went sideways. "We need him to think you're unguarded," Kara said as she laid everything out. "After that, we set up the trap. You'll be in the house, making it look like a regular night. You'll be alone, and he'll see it as his chance to finish what he started. We'll bait him with a message, a sign that you're ready to be caught." Emma stared at the tools, her pulse thudding in her ears. "And when he shows up?" she asked, her breath quickening. Kara looked her in the eyes, the gravity of her words sinking in. "We'll be ready." The sound of rain tapping on the window was like the countdown of a ticking clock. Emma stood up, steadying herself against the table. This was it. Her life, her fate, was about to collide with the man she thought she knew. The plan was dangerous, reckless even. But it was her only shot. She couldn't run anymore. Not from Mark. And not from the truth. Kara packed up the tools, her movements swift and precise. "We have to move quickly," she said, her voice sharp. "The sooner we set the trap, the better. We can't let him get too close." Emma felt the weight of the decision press on her chest, but she stood straighter. "I'm ready." Kara gave a slight nod, a glimmer of approval in her eyes.
"Good.
Let's end this." The rain outside intensified, the storm now a full roar. Inside, the storm was quieter, but it was just as fierce. And this time, Emma wasn't going to let herself be swept away. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Kara gathered the final pieces of their plan, her movements precise, each one calculated. Emma stood by the door, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The trap was set. Her body felt like it was moving on its own, shaking with fear, but also fueled by a fire she didn't know she had. "I'll wait outside," Kara said, breaking the silence. Emma turned to face her. "Outside?" she asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Kara nodded, her expression steely. "Make it look like you're completely alone." I'll be close by, watching. If anything goes wrong, I'll be there. But you need to lure him in without him realizing it." Emma's mouth went dry. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." Kara stepped toward her, her eyes softening just for a moment. "Stay calm. Stick to the plan, and don't let him see your fear. He'll use it against you." Emma swallowed hard, a shiver running down her spine. "Don't worry," she said, her voice steadier now. "I won't let him win." Kara gave a curt nod and moved toward the door, slipping out into the rain-soaked night. Emma stood alone, the weight of the plan settling over her like a thick fog. The room felt colder now, the silence deafening. She had to stay in control. She had to act like she was just another victim, waiting to be found. Her pulse raced as she went to the small table and picked up the burner phone Kara had given her. She quickly typed the message, her fingers shaking as she hit send. "I'm alone. Come and finish this." Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen, waiting for a response. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then there it was. A single word. "Coming." Emma's hands clenched the phone tightly, her heart skipping a beat. He was coming. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on her. She wiped her damp palms on her jeans, trying to steady her breath. The plan had to work. It had to. She glanced toward the door, her eyes flicking to the window. Every sound outside felt like an omen, every passing car, every gust of wind. She wasn't just waiting for Mark to show up. She was waiting for everything to change.
Her phone buzzed again.
This time, the message was different. "I know you're here. I'll make it quick." Emma's stomach dropped as a cold chill ran through her veins. The final confirmation. Mark was here. She turned off the phone and dropped it on the table, her hands trembling. Time seemed to stretch as she moved toward the door. Every step felt like it echoed in the quiet house, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the terror inside her. She had to be ready. She had to make this count. With one last glance at the window, she reached for the knife Kara had given her, its cold steel solid in her grip. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, the pounding thud of her heart as it synchronized with the storm outside. And then there was a sound, a faint rustling at the door, a soft tap, a breath. Mark was here. The tap at the door sent a jolt of terror through Emma's body. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. She held the knife tightly, her knuckles white, her mind racing. Mark was outside. He was so close. She could hear the faintest shuffle of feet against the old floorboards, the slow, deliberate pace that only someone who knew they were in control would use. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. The door handle rattled. Her breath caught in her throat, the world narrowing down to just that sound. Her eyes flicked to the window, to the empty street beyond. There was no sign of Kara, no sign of anything. Just the oppressive silence of the room and the threat that hovered on the other side of the door. Another rattle. Emma forced herself to exhale, her mind clearing, her thoughts sharpening. She couldn't show fear. Not now. With every ounce of willpower, she steadied her breath. She moved silently, every step measured, as she crouched near the door. The knife felt cold against her palm, and she tightened her grip on it, ready for whatever came next. Mark's shadow passed by the crack under the door, his presence unmistakable. He was here. And Emma was ready. The door creaked open just a crack. She saw his face, that familiar, terrifying smirk. But what he didn't see was the way Emma's fingers wrapped around the handle of the knife. With one quick, sharp movement, she thrust it forward, just as Mark's hand reached for the door. The blade caught him in the side, a gasp escaping his lips as he staggered back. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, Mark's eyes locked onto hers, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. "You thought you could," he growled, but the words were cut short as Emma pushed him back, slamming the door shut. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, but she didn't let it take control. She couldn't. Mark banged against the door, the sound of him pounding it with his fists like thunder. "Let me in," he yelled, his voice low and guttural. But Emma didn't move. She stayed silent, waiting. The storm outside raged louder, but Emma knew something now. She was no longer afraid. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. She was going to survive. The pounding at the door grew more desperate, Mark's anger and frustration building with each strike. Emma stood motionless, her breath slow and steady, the knife still in her hand. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. Mark's voice became more ragged as he shouted, "You can't hide from me, Emma. You're mine." But Emma knew something he didn't. She wasn't his anymore. The sound of his fists hitting the door faded, and Emma waited in silence, listening intently for any sign of movement. It was then that she heard it, the faintest sound from outside. A soft rustling in the rain. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was Kara.
Kara was there.
Emma's pulse raced as she carefully moved toward the window, peering out through the drawn curtains. Through the mist of rain, she saw Kara standing by the car, watching the door. Emma's eyes locked onto Kara's, a silent understanding passing between them. Kara wasn't going to let Mark escape. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside Emma. Everything she'd feared, everything she'd been running from, was now at a head. But it wasn't Mark who held the power anymore. It was Emma. The wind howled outside as Mark's voice died down, replaced by the sound of footsteps retreating from the door. Emma took a breath, her grip tightening on the knife. And then, as if the world itself had exhaled, the silence returned. Emma didn't move for a moment. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was clear now. She had survived. She wasn't just a victim. She had become something else. Kara knocked softly on the door, her face unreadable. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Emma nodded, her breath steadying. "It's over." The storm had passed, and Emma had finally taken control of her own fate. There would be no more running, no more hiding. She was free.